What if I told you that in 1973, a small-town postal worker began receiving letters addressed to people who had been dead for decades? And what if I told you that every single one of those letters received a reply? Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbing cases in Postal Service history, a story so bizarre that it was buried in government archives for over 50 years. This is the story of Harold Whitmore, the mailman who became the bridge between the living and the dead. Harold Whitmore had been delivering mail in the quiet town of Millbrook Falls for 27 years. He knew every street, every house, every family. So when letters began arriving, addressed to Margaret Holloway at 13 Elm Street, Harold was confused. Margaret Holloway had died in 1948. Harold remembered her funeral. He had delivered her death certificate to the coroner's office himself. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. The envelope was yellowed, as if it had been sitting somewhere for decades, and the handwriting was spidery and old-fashioned. The return address simply read "A friend." Harold checked his records twice. Margaret Holloway, deceased 1948. The house at 13 Elm Street had been empty for 25 years. Following protocol, Harold should have returned the letter to sender. But something about that envelope made his hands shake. Instead, he found himself walking up the overgrown path to the abandoned house. Its windows boarded up, paint peeling like diseased skin. He slipped the letter through a crack in the door and walked away, telling himself he was just being thorough. Next morning, Harold's blood turned to ice water in his veins. In the mailbox at 13 Elm Street sat a response letter. The envelope was crisp, white, and new. The handwriting was different from the original letter, flowing and elegant in the style of someone educated in the early 1900s. The return address read simply, M. Holloway. Harold's hands trembled as he picked up the letter. It was warm to the touch, as if it had just been written. But that was impossible. No one had lived in that house for a quarter of a century. Harold had checked the house himself the day before. The door was still sealed shut, the windows still boarded. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside. That was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, more letters began arriving. Letters addressed to Thomas Brennan, who had died in the influenza pandemic of 1918. Letters for Sarah Chen, who had perished in a factory fire in 1931. Letters for the Morrison family, all 7 members who had died in a carbon monoxide poisoning in 1956. Each letter was old, yellowed, written in a different hand, and every single one received a reply. Harold began keeping a record. He photographed every envelope, documented every delivery, catalogued every response. The pattern was always the same. Letters would arrive addressed to the deceased. Harold would deliver them to their last known addresses. And the next day, without fail, a response would appear. The content of the letters, when Harold finally worked up the courage to steam one open, was even more disturbing than their existence. The incoming letters were written by people claiming to be friends or relatives of the deceased. People writing as if they were still alive, still part of the same world. They discussed mundane things, whether neighborhood gossip, plans for Sunday dinner, but they also mentioned events that had happened decades after the recipients had died. Margaret Holloway's correspondent wrote about the new shopping mall that had opened in 1972. Thomas Brennan's pen pal discussed the moon landing. Sarah Chun's letter writer mentioned television shows that hadn't existed until the 1960s. It was as if these letter writers existed in some strange temporal bubble, aware of modern events but still connected to people who had died long ago. The responses were even stranger. Written in the handwriting and speech patterns of their respective eras, they nevertheless demonstrated knowledge of current events. Margaret Holloway wrote about being pleased that women could finally wear pants to work. Thomas Brennan mentioned how strange it was to hear about people traveling to the moon. Sarah Chen expressed amazement at the idea of moving pictures in people's homes. Harold began to lose sleep. The logical part of his mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Someone was playing an elaborate prank, but who and how? Harold had started watching the houses where he delivered these letters. He would park his truck across the street and wait, sometimes for hours. He never saw anyone enter or leave. The houses remained as empty and lifeless as graves. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday in June. Harold arrived at the Brennan house, a Victorian mansion that had been condemned since 1968, to find not just a letter in the mailbox, but something else, a photograph. It showed Thomas Brennan, unmistakably the same man whose funeral portrait hung in the town hall, standing in front of his house. But in the photograph, the house wasn't the rotting ruin Harold saw before him. It was pristine, freshly painted, with a manicured garden and modern cars parked in the driveway. At the bottom of the photograph, in Thomas Brennan's familiar spidery handwriting, were the words, "Harold, thank you for keeping us connected. Some doors should never be fully closed." Harold stared at the photograph until his vision blurred. In the background, barely visible in one of the house's windows, was a figure. A man in a postal uniform, holding a letter. The figure had Harold's face. That night, Harold broke into the town records office. He needed answers, even if it meant losing his job. What he found in the archives made his blood run cold. The postal delivery records from 1948 showed that Harold Whitmore had been delivering mail to Margaret Holloway right up until the day she died. But according to those same records, Harold had started working for the Postal Service in 1946, when he was 18 years old. Harold had been born in 1955. He was 18 years old in 1973, the year the strange letters began arriving. The personnel files told an impossible story. Harold Whitmore had worked for the Millbrook Falls Post Office from 1946 to 1973. The photograph in his file showed the same face, the same man, unchanged by 27 years. At the bottom of the file, in the supervisor's notes, was a single line. Harold demonstrates unusual dedication to completing deliveries to all addresses on his route. Regardless of circumstances, Harold ran from the records office, his mind reeling. He drove through the empty streets of Millbrook Falls, past houses where he had delivered letters to the dead, past mailboxes that shouldn't have been able to receive replies. Everything looked different now, as if he was seeing the town through different eyes. Some of the houses he passed seemed to flicker, showing glimpses of how they had looked decades ago. When their deceased residents were still alive, he ended up at his own apartment, but when he looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, he saw something that made him scream. His reflection was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not obviously wrong, but wrong in the way that a photograph negative is wrong. Everything was reversed. His part was on the wrong side. His watch was on the wrong wrist. Even the scar on his chin from a childhood accident was on the wrong side of his face. Harold realized then that he wasn't looking at his reflection. He was looking at someone else. Someone who looked exactly like him, but wasn't him. Someone who had been delivering mail in Millbrook Falls since 1946, connecting the living and the dead, keeping open the doors that should have been closed. The next morning, Harold didn't report to work. The postal supervisor, a man named Bill Morrison, found Harold's truck parked outside the post office with the keys still in the ignition. All of Harold's undelivered letters were gone. Bill checked the records and found something that made him question his own sanity. Harold Whitmore had never been employed by the Millbrook Falls Post Office. There was no personnel file, no employment record, no trace of his existence in any of the official documents. But the strange letters continued to arrive, and every day they received their replies. Bill Morrison tried to investigate, but every lead ended in a dead end. The letter writers didn't exist in any records. The addresses they provided led to empty lots or businesses that had been demolished decades ago. The postmarks came from post offices that had been closed since the Great Depression. It was as if the letters were arriving from a parallel world, a world where the dead still lived and time moved differently. The truth, Bill finally realized, was far more disturbing than any hoax or supernatural explanation. The letters weren't arriving from another world. They were arriving from another time. Millbrook Falls existed in multiple temporal layers, with the past and present bleeding through in places where the barriers had grown thin. The dead weren't really dead in the way most people understood death. They had simply moved to a different layer of time, one that overlapped with the present just enough to allow for communication. Harold Whitmore had been the bridge between these layers. Not human in the conventional sense, but something else. Something that had taken Harold's form and Harold's memories and Harold's dedication to completing his postal route. No matter how strange the circumstances, something that had been delivering mail in Millbrook Falls for decades, maybe centuries, maintaining the connections between the living and the dead. The residents of Millbrook Falls learned to live with their unusual postal service. Letters continued to arrive for the deceased, and the deceased continued to reply. Children grew up thinking this was normal. Newcomers to the town were told it was a local tradition, a way of honoring the dead. Most accepted this explanation and never asked too many questions. But sometimes, late at night, residents would see a figure in a postal uniform walking the empty streets, carrying a mailbag that seemed far too heavy for any mortal man to carry. The figure would stop at houses where no one had lived for decades, sliding letters under doors or into mailboxes that should have been empty. And in the morning, those letters would be gone, replaced by responses written in handwriting that belonged to the dead. The official records state that Harold Whitmore never existed. But if you visit Millbrook Falls today, you can still see the evidence of his work. Letters addressed to the deceased still arrive at the post office. They're delivered to empty houses, condemned buildings, and overgrown lots where homes once stood, and every single one receives a reply. The current postal supervisor, Bill Morrison's son, has a theory. He believes that death isn't an ending, but a transition to a different kind of existence. One where time works differently, where the past and present exist simultaneously, where love and connection can transcend the boundaries between life and death. The letters are proof that somewhere, somehow, the people we've lost are still with us, still caring about our lives, still wanting to stay connected. But there's another theory, one that keeps the residents of Millbrook Falls awake at night. Maybe the letters aren't coming from the dead at all. Maybe they're coming from the living, from people who are trapped between worlds, unable to move on, unable to let go. People like Harold Whitmore, who was so dedicated to his job that he continued working even after his own death. Even after his own existence was erased from the official records. Maybe the real horror isn't that the dead can send letters. Maybe it's that some people are so unable to accept death that they create their own version of life, one where they can continue to exist, continue to work, continue to deliver mail to houses that should be empty. The letters still arrive in Millbrook Falls, they're still delivered to the dead, and they still receive replies. If you ever find yourself in that quiet town, check the mailboxes. You might find a letter addressed to someone you once knew, someone you thought you had lost forever. And if you're very unlucky, you might find a letter addressed to you, written in handwriting you don't recognize, from someone claiming to be a friend. Because in Millbrook Falls, death is just another stop on the postal route. And Harold Whitmore is still making his deliveries.